Okay, welcome to another Lit Matters. The focus of this video is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, with a particular focus on an analysis of 5 key quotations. I'm going to take you through a number of Stevenson's language choices and language techniques, as well as the odd structural device and a few themes that are of particular interest to Stevenson, and you never know, they might come up in an extract question in an exam if you're lucky, or they might just be ones that you could use in a more extended essay response. Right, off we go. The first one then. Well, sir, the two ran into one another naturally enough at the corner. And then came the horrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. Nice. That's Mr. Enfield on his first encounter with Mr. Hyde. Okay, how to analyse them? Well, firstly, I think you should go after one or two of Stevenson's verb choices. Really zoom in on a word and squeeze the meaning out of it. So, for example, trampled. That suggests a certain violence, a carelessness, a heartlessness, perhaps even a touch of animalisation there, as if it's a stampede. Certainly a lack of humanity, even though he does this calmly. And then also maybe the screaming. I think when you're analysing individual words, it's often helpful to consider perhaps diluting the verb or the adjective and sort of comparing that version with the one chosen by the author. So for instance, you know, what would be the difference if he left her calling out on the ground or crying on the ground? It's not quite as intense as screaming, which suggests like more pain and more suffering, more intensity altogether. The second point of analysis, I think, is a structural one, and that's juxtaposition, which is of course placing of two things next to one another or in close proximity that don't quite go together, or don't sit naturally together, and so the difference between them is kind of emphasized. Here we've got Stevenson uses juxtaposition that works on a number of levels. Firstly, you've got a man and a child. Secondly, you've got the fact that the man is upright and walking away from the violence he's just inflicted. And then thirdly, you've got the fact that the child is on the ground, prone on the floor. And thirdly, you've got the fact that he is doing so calmly, while the child is anything but calm. Right, second one then. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces, and there was the man in the middle, with a kind of black, sneering coolness. Frightened too, I could see that, but carrying it off, sir, really like Satan. Here's Mr. Enfield again to Mr. Utterson in the aftermath of that trampling of the child, as a London mob sort of accosts Mr. Hyde and surrounds him. Again, a couple of things going on here, a couple of themes that I think are worthy of some consideration. Firstly, that of duality, the idea of two opposites being contained in one, the yin and the yang, and perhaps good and evil being contained within one. Here you see Hyde is outwardly sneering and evil, and has this coolness, this arrogance about him. But inwardly there's some fear, he's frightened, there's a touch of vulnerability. So again, it's a bit of foreshadowing here that Jekyll is Hyde and Hyde is Jekyll, but we're not to know that at this stage. But it's that theme, that yin and the yang, the good and evil contained within the one or within an individual. Again, a very important idea in Macbeth. Think about where transferring some of your analysis from Macbeth over to Jekyll and Hyde, because lots of similarities there. You know, you have the good and evil within nature, or within Macbeth, or by extension perhaps within all of us. Here something similar going on. The second theme that really closely connected to that is that of superficiality, which is where you cannot trust the surface. The surface lies and deceives as to what the reality is underneath. Again, important in Macbeth, and here Hyde is projecting this confidence and this arrogance, but inside it there is something perhaps the opposite, and the reference there to Satan, I think if you could touch upon. That's a reference to Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost, where Satan is the protagonist, the main character there, and he is outwardly this hellish beast, this leader of the fallen angels that is defying God and rebelling and all the rest of it, but inwardly is a complex individual, is in some respects selfless or very self-conscious, aware of the suffering of others, and racked by self-doubt. Again, all relevant to Hyde. Okay, on we go. The man seems hardly human, something troglodytic. If ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend, Mr. Utterson, on Mr. Hyde in chapter 2. The first thing I think that leaps out at you here from this is a touch of sibilance here. Well, not a touch, quite a lot of it actually. What is sibilance? Well, easy. It's just alliteration, but specifically of the S sound. It's the repetition of the S sound. So here you have Satan's signature upon a face. It is repeated S sound several times. I don't think many candidates are going to be able to discuss this, so if you can, I think you make yourself stand out a bit. And it should sound like a hissing, you know, almost like a snake hissing. And for students of English literature, that should recall immediately Satan again and the devil. Again, you could bring it back to Milton's Paradise Lost, where Satan seduces Eve in the Garden of Eden by disguising himself as a snake. Yep, so there you go. The next place I'll go to here is Stevenson's adjective choice here, something troglodytic, the adjective there from the noun troglodyte. A troglodyte is a caveman. So here that adjective suggests there's something primitive about Hyde, something rudimental, slightly barbaric or savage about him, that taps into this way back in the mists of time, something deep within us, but that is distant to us and that doesn't make sense to us and is out of control. Certainly it strips him of his humanity and makes him seem quite other. So very, very worth analysing that adjective. Okay, fourthly then, the other snarled aloud into a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he had unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. Mr. Utterson about Mr. Hyde. That's chapter 2, so still quite early on. Again here, I think one or two verb choices you could go after. The snarled, that suggests an aggression, suggests a violence, and is closely linked with the technique of animalization. You know, there he is animalized, he is turned into a canine of some sort, a dog or a wolf, and is more of a threat because of that. This is backed up further or compounded by the fact that he has got a savage laugh, again suggesting something quite barbaric and quite inhuman, to build on that animalization. And then another key theme for Stevenson in Jekyll and Hyde, that of mystery here. It's not clear quite where this laugh comes from, nor the extraordinary quickness that he's got. You know, suggests a hint of that he's animal, or he's other, or he's certainly not human. And then he doesn't know how he's scarpered so quickly and legged it into the house, but he has. Didn't know how he managed that, and poor Utterson, that's the extent of his knowledge. That's it. That's as much as he knows. So there's a couple of levels of mystery there, which is of course what Stevenson wants. We find out as in the same way that Utterson does, and Utterson sort of goes from a journey from ignorance to enlightenment, just as we the reader do, and quite deliberate from Stevenson. He's dragging out the tension and making us, revealing the truth bit by bit by bit. Okay, lastly then, Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds and clubbed him to the earth, and next moment, with ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered and the body jumped upon the roadway. Yeah, lovely stuff. This is, of course, the murder of Sir Danvers Carew in chapter 4, witnessed by the maid at her window. Firstly here, if this were in an extract in an exam, I think it'd be pretty lucky, by the way, but there might be some ideas here you can use in an essay. I'd go after some of these verb choices. Okay, firstly, that clubbed him to the earth. Didn't knock him to the earth or punch him to the earth or beat him to the earth, but clubbed him to the earth. There's an extra violence there, an extra force to that battering he gives him, and the club suggests, again, recalls that troglodytic adjective, something of the caveman about Mr. Hyde, something where he doesn't seem quite human, and sort of clubbing him like a caveman, you know, me bring home food, me bring home meat for family in the cave. Okay, another verb choice, the trampling again, we've mentioned that before. But perhaps my favourite here is the way in which the bones are broken. They're not broken; they are shattered, rather. So with a force that is quite unusual, rare violence, and that the bones are now shattered, so that they're not just broken; they're smashed into smithereens. Carefully chosen verbs by Stevenson here. To build on that, I'd mention the adverb choice. Adverbs normally, almost always, words that end in ly and describe the way in which something has happened or an action has taken place, and they can just add a whole another layer of meaning to a sentence. So here the bones were not just shattered, they were audibly shattered, i.e. it could be heard. The sound of the bones breaking could be heard. It was that forceful, that violent. Nice touch from Stevenson there, presumably by this poor old maid who sat there just trying to have a little daydream at a bedroom window, but is disturbed so rudely. Right, next up, simile. Okay, as ever with extracts or in an essay, you should use the correct subject terminology and name the devices as and when you see them, call them out, as it were. But don't expect too many marks for just spotting a simile and going, I found a simile, good for me. Year 7s can do that fairly easily. You need to be explaining to numerous levels, and the depth and the quality of your explanations will determine how many marks you get. Okay, so here the ape-like fury is the simile, of course, but you can analyze that to many levels. Fury is an anger, is a passionate vehemence to his actions, and ape-like is particularly significant because once again it's that animalization technique that strips Hyde of his humanity, but also it's particularly significant in that it's an ape, given that in the middle of the Victorian era, the publishing of perhaps one of the most important, significant books of the century, or in fact of any century of our species, is of course Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which is 1858, 1859, one of those, and which rocks the establishment worldview and explodes a few myths and shatters our perception of ourselves, our sense of our own identity. As Darwin reveals the wonders of evolution and the incremental random process of natural selection and genetic mutation, and this destroys some of the central key tenets of many, if not all, religions, and forces people to perhaps rethink or question how they see themselves and where do they come from, as well as what's the meaning of life, or what's the purpose of it all. And this is quite shocking and quite dramatic for the Victorians. At once they are shocked out of their comfort zone. They're no longer perhaps the chosen one, chosen by God and made perfectly formed, and always have been in our current state, but suddenly our close proximity to the natural world and the animal world is underlined and highlighted, and that's perhaps particularly uncomfortable or inconvenient for many Victorians. Here for Hyde, it's a sense of just how close are we to the animal world? What animal urges do we retain? Where does the animal end and the human begin? So a lot of those ideas are worthy of some analysis. Lastly, metaphor, perhaps the most important language device. Here you have hailing down upon poor old Danvers Carews this storm of blows. Now that suggests a weather phenomenon, the storm, a natural phenomenon, a elemental force that Hyde has to his violence. And again, like as with nature, you can't control it. It's completely out of your control, and sometimes humans are subject to the whims of nature and can do nothing about it but just suffer it, much like poor Sir Danvers Carew does with Hyde battering him like that. Okay, that's about your lot. I hope that is of some use to you. Do leave a comment below with some suggestions of how these videos could be better or any requests that you'd like to see.
Pressure.